Very much, everyone. Now, as you can hear, I've had the wonderful benefit of a visit from my 15-month-old grandson. He brought this and generously shared it, so I hope I am audible at the back. Am I? Good, okay. I've spent my life addressing meetings of students on issues of history which seem to me of supreme importance. But of all the thousands of hours I've spent doing that, none have mattered as much as these last two occasions in which I've been able to speak to my fellow Scots about the decision that we have to make for the future of our country in September. Nothing compares to that. I want to start by looking very briefly at two matters that are not going to be resolved if there should be a no vote. And I then want to go on and deal with four of the principal reasons why I, and I hope you, will be voting yes in September. I want to begin with a personal story. It goes back to 1967, not because of the Hamilton by-election, but because it happened to be the first time I went to the United States of America. And I was attending a conference on the future of higher education. I took with me immense pride in the United Kingdom's system of higher education. Nationally funded, independently administered, and available to everybody who could benefit from it, even with the provision of state grants. I also took with me enormous pride in our post-war welfare state. The United Kingdom's wonderful benefit from that conflict, including particularly its National Health Service with the principle of universality running through it like a ribbon. Thanks to the generosity of my hosts, I was able to go to a number of fine universities: Southern Illinois, Chicago, MIT in Boston, Harvard, and New York. And for all the wonderful qualities of those institutions, I came back with my pride in the values of the UK's system of higher education and in the United Kingdom's welfare state and its health service, even more deeply entrenched and more deeply held. I have not changed in my fealty to those values. I have not lost them. I'm afraid that the United Kingdom has. And when I vote yes in September, I will not be leaving it. It has long ago left me. And there is no way that a no vote in September will restore the United Kingdom in which it was once possible to repose so much pride. The other thing that a no vote in September will not do is it will not add one single power to the Holyrood Parliament. And I know this, and so do you if you think about it, for the very parties who now have been rushing around promising or half promising or semi-pledging or sort of suggesting various changes in favour of Holyrood are the same parties who ensured by their carefully managed disagreements that there would be no Devo anything on September's ballot paper. Why did they do it? Because they knew that if there had been Devo Max or anything like it on the ballot paper, all the polls said it would have won easily. And then those same parties would have been forced to bring forward the very legislation that they had spent their years in office failing to produce. The fact that they didn't do it then and that they made sure that we were not asked means that they will not do it in future. Their suggestions are false and should not be trusted. Let me turn now to my four reasons for voting yes. And the first is the most important, most fundamental. It's what I would call the real democratic deficit. And I don't just mean the fact that in Scotland often we can vote for a governing party which is then not installed in Westminster. After all, we have one Tory MP and we are currently governed by a Conservative-dominated government. It's worse than that. There was a period of time, what historians call the post-war consensus, from 1945 through the 40s, 50s, substantially into the 60s, where there was a common ground in British politics. A large public sector of utilities and services, a healthy private sector, and a welfare state, and the principle of universality in the NHS. But that common polity is gone. It no longer exists. And we have had the extraordinary experience for 15 years of being able to see in embryo what a future independent Scottish government might be like. In those 15 years since 1999, we've had a Labour administration, a Labour Liberal administration, a minority Scottish National administration, and now a majority one. And they have all trended in roughly the same direction. Broadly speaking, social democratic, progressive in matters of welfare and society. But look at the case in Westminster. It has gone in exactly the opposite direction. Nothing shows it better than to look at the National Health Service. The National Health Service, there always were two. The National Health Service in England basically does not exist anymore in the terms in which it was originally conceived. The Secretary of State for Health no longer even has the legal duty to be answerable to the House for the provision of a national service across the country as a whole. And it's been stricken from the legislation. And in its place, there is enshrined the principle of commercial competition. The English health service is fragmented, broken up, commercialised, privatised. What has happened in Scotland? Since 1999, Mr. Blair's marketisation reforms have been turned back, and the Scottish Health Service has gone back to the principles upon which it was originally founded, a genuine national integrated service across the country as a whole. We no longer have a single polity in which it's fair enough to think that a vote in Eyemouth or in Leith or Glasgow is like a vote in Yorkshire or a vote in the southwest of England, where I spent most of my professional life. Instead, we have two not only different polities, but fundamentally opposed and different polities. And it is a simple matter of democratic health that we cannot go on like this, with our polity constantly in danger of being overwhelmed by a larger one, which is not only different, but which is pursuing fundamentally different and opposed ideas and principles. Simply to maintain our existence as a democracy, we must have our own independent government, and for that we must vote yes. Secondly, I want to turn to Scotland benefiting from its own resources. The list is enormous. I could go on about wave power, I could go on about our whisky industry, but I want to speak about oil and gas. For 40-odd years, our revenues and resources from oil and gas have been frittered away by Westminster governments on bad budgeting by Labour governments in the 1970s and on the subsidised privatisation of public utilities by the Conservatives in the 80s and afterwards. Don't believe me, read Alan Clark's diaries. He says quite clearly that Thatcher could never have privatised the public utilities as cheaply if it had not been for the proceeds of the North Sea. And it isn't just the North Sea. We knew last year that there were 40 to 50 years of revenue still to come from that. And that was before the big new field that opened off Aberdeen about 2 months ago with 22 wells, let alone the giant discoveries at Bentley field to the east of Shetland, which have just come up this week. 700 million barrels of oil over 35 years, 20 million barrels a year. And that's only the start of it. There's the Scottish Atlantic margin, that huge area of Scottish territorial waters out into the Atlantic, which recently, again in the last few weeks, has shown new successful wells, Lancaster, and now the Clare Ridge. You remember that mysterious trip by Mr. Cameron unannounced in advance to Shetland. The Clare Ridge discoveries are both richer in quantity and in quality than anything that had been expected. The last major report on this area, the Scottish Atlantic margin, said simply, the largest oil field in the world is west of Lewis. And that's not the end. There's the west coast and the area of the Clyde, which we cannot investigate at the moment because of Trident. So let's have the next, not 40, not 50, but decades and decades on of our oil wealth and resources coming to reindustrialize and develop our own country. And then I come to the third reason. I want to see the end of those gigantic projects that we pay for, but which bring no benefit to Scotland. Oh, I'm not talking about Crossrail in London, or the new London sewer system, or indeed any of the new proposals that Boris had just thought up as means of spending money better in Croydon than he does than in Strathclyde. Let's just take that high-speed train, which may reach Leeds by 2030, and no plans for it to come on to Scotland. And we are due to pay 4.7 billion for the privilege of that particular development. But worse than all of those, of course, is Trident. It is not only a ludicrous weapon, completely useless in the world of international terrorism, it is also obscenely immoral and disgustingly expensive. It's going to cost us over 1 billion every year for more than a decade for our share of this obscenity on the doorstep of my city, because despite the funny noise I'm making tonight, I'm a Glaswegian born and bred. And it has made of our largest city, and roughly 25% of our population, the largest nuclear target in Western Europe. That is a disgrace, it's an obscenity, it must end, and the only way it will is with a yes vote in September. Fourthly, I'm not a narrow nationalist, I'm an internationalist. That's why I'm voting yes. Only a yes vote will ensure that Scotland retains its place, retains, not applies to join, but retains its place in the European Union and is able to play its proper role with twice the number of MPs, a seat on the Council of Ministers, representation within the Commission itself, play its role in the continent to whose culture our country has always belonged. And beyond that, I want to see us playing our part in the United Nations and the wider world. Only that will come with a yes vote. With a no vote, we run the risk of being hoiked out of Europe by England's increasingly Europhobic and Eurosceptic voters in a referendum in 2017. So, for real democracy, for the revenues from our own oil and gas, for the removal of Trident, and for occupying and beginning to play our part in the wider world, I want us to vote yes. And it's not just these physical resources that I've been talking about. It's the human resources of Scotland. It's us, you, me. We represent, as a recent report showed, the most educated country in Europe, bar none. The third most educated country in the entire world. So, when we come to September the 18th, this is no ordinary vote. This is something special, and each of us will bear with us as we go to the polling booth. The most precious cargo of all, the future of all our futures. In a way, it reminds me of the speech Robert Bolt wrote for Sir Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons. More talking about the importance of an oath that he had given, spoke of feeling that he looked as though he held his life like water in his hands. If I do out my fingers, I need not think to see my life again. That will be what will happen to us if there is a no vote. but with a yes vote, we can not only secure the health and well-being of our present, the future of all our futures for our children and grandchildren, but we can also pay a tribute to that generation which fought for the United Kingdom, in which one could once have been proud in the Second World War, and fought not only against Nazism, but fought for a better world after the war. And I'm reminded of one of our greatest poets, William Souter, writing in 1940 in the presence of that war and thoughts about the future, in a poem called Scotland. And he posed a question, which is very much the question that is posed to us. And he said, "Have ye the unconceived that sees a tween and a tween? That world, this world that lies in licht, yon world that hasn't been. It's our late for fear, our early for disclaim. When ye come hameless here, and ken ye are at hame, for our futures, vote yes."